Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radios in your future. This segment ought to be a good one. Now we're going to be talking to Elliot Eisenberg, PhD. He's a nationally acclaimed economist and public speaker specializing in making the arcane and minutiae of economics fun, relevant, and educational. I can speak to that firsthand. He earned his BA in economics and first-class honors from McGill University in Montreal, as well as a master's and PhD in public administration from Syracuse. He's also the creator of the Multifamily Stock Index, and much, much more. He's author of more than 85 articles. He's a regular blogger, as well as a consultant to several large real estate professional associations. Long history in the financial and real estate world. Elliot, how are you, my friend?
I am terrific. Thank you for asking. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
Well, do people refer to you as doctor? Do I need to refer to you as Dr. Eisenberg?
If you wish, you may, but you may also call me Elliot. Please do.
All right. Well, let's do this. I know you spend a lot of your time traveling around the country. You're talking about real estate, but maybe even on a larger level, just the economy in general. And I'm very interested just to get your take from whichever perspective you'd like to give it. Where are we in early 2016? Where grade our economy right now, A to F?
All right, look, the economy's okay. There's nothing shiningly spectacular about the economy. I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind. A lot of people think, it's going to get much better. No, I don't think it's going to get much better. Energy prices are going to stay low, which hurts the oil patch. Manufacturing is a little bit weak because of the strong dollar, and also in part because of the oil patch, and corporate investment in equipment isn't so great. But everything else is fine. And that gets us about 90% of our economy. The service sector is doing well, 85%. The construction sector is doing fine, be it residential or non-residential or industrial. So we're okay. And as long as we keep creating, let's say, 160, 170, 180,000 jobs a month, we will avoid a recession, and 2016 will look very similar to 2015. So this panic about, China and Europe and Japan and Brazil and Russia, either all in recession or slowing in the case of China, is overblown and I think very misplaced. We're a big enough economy. We can withstand some bad news. We've gone through a lot of bad news in the last 6 or 7 years, and this doesn't look any worse than any earlier weakness patch that we've overcome.
Well, that was kind of going to be my next question, and that is, you can't help but hear and kind of feel at some level that we are more than ever tied to sort of a world economic system and tied to the world. And what you're saying is, calm down a little bit. We're strong on our own, and China, while may be a little bit of a pain in the rear, really is not enough to really do the kind of damage people are talking about.
That's generally right. I mean, if China were to really unravel badly, that could certainly have some very negative repercussions, and maybe it could throw us into a recession indirectly. It wouldn't be our exports to China. They're too small to matter. But it would hurt Europe. It would really crush industrial prices for agricultural commodities and industrial commodities, oil and copper and nickel and all those things. And that would have tertiary effects on our economy. But outside of that, if China just continues to slow like it has over the last 5 or 6 years, for the next 5 or 10 years, we'll be okay. Again, we're not big enough. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we could pull the economy out of a recession or drive them in because of our behavior. We're not big enough anymore. China's too big, and Europe's too big, and other countries, and Brazil, and so on. But we can certainly keep a recession at bay with a healthy economy, and our economy is healthy enough. Labor growth has been good. Wage growth is finally starting to take place now. After a really prolonged period of very meager growth, last 6 or 8 months things are better, and just last month inflation began to take off a little bit, which is very good news because we've had such low levels, almost no inflation at all. These are all pretty positive signs.
What about, we can't have this discussion, of course, without talking about our friends at the Fed. And what about, they've raised interest rates, 25 basis points. What do you see for the balance of the year, and what is the reasoning? And if you see them doing it, do you agree with that?
Okay. a lot of questions there. So the Fed's going to raise rates. It's almost inconceivable the Fed will go this year without raising rates. Unemployment rates are 4.9%, and at that low level, and they'll continue to fall as the year goes through, so we could have by the end of the year 4.5. It's impossible to have really full employment, 4.5% full employment, and have a Fed funds rate of 25 basis points. What's going to, I think, really determine this is GDP growth on one hand, obviously, labor force growth, as I mentioned, and critically, inflation rates. If we continue to see very anemic inflation rates like we've seen until last month, really low inflation rates the last couple of months, they'll have a very hard time raising rates. They may raise them once. But if inflation that we saw last month continues over the course of the year, and we end up seeing close to 2% inflation year over year, the Fed's going to raise several times. Because if they don't, the bond vigilantes, if you will start raising rates for them, and the Fed doesn't want to cede that control to the market. So I still expect a rate rise in June, probably one in September, certainly one in December. So I'm thinking 2 rate rises over the course of the year, and maybe 3, certainly not one before June. That's not going to happen.
Elliot, are you, when you say you think you could project maybe 2 rate rises, some people might think that's aggressive. Do you think in agreement with most economists, or is your view unique?
I don't think it's that unique. No, I think I'm pretty middle of the road-ish. The market, however, you look at Wall Street, they don't see this many rate increases. If you talk to economists, they do. So there's been this disconnect for a while. So maybe I'm being a little bit too aggressive. Last year, I thought the economy would have done better. Inflation might have occurred earlier, and so on and so forth. I thought they would raise in September. They held off for arguably good reasons. So maybe I'm a little optimistic.
What about? How does that sound? Yeah, no, that's good. You also have a long background working with real estate professionals, real estate associations, in the housing market. I'm curious, kind of taking a little bit different path on this discussion now, is do you see the new first-time home buyers, the younger buyers, millennials, if you want to call them that, what are their house purchasing habits, and is that changing the real estate industry in any way, shape, or form?
Millennials, we don't know. Interestingly enough, we still don't know much about these kids. They're now aged about 20 to 35, roughly. That's the ballpark. What's critical about them is they are now beginning to enter key home buying ages. 31, 32 is the peak of home buying. So they're just, the oldest ones now are just beyond that. But you've got 60 million of them coming up in the future, 50 million more coming up between ages 20 and 34, 31, 32. So we don't know a lot about them, but we know they're going to get married, they're going to have kids, they're going to want a place to live. The big question I think that builders and developers and realtors have to think about is what kind of lifestyle do these kids want to lead? Many of them have grown up on, of course, smartphones and Uber apps, and they don't need to have a car. They want to live downtown. They don't want to own. They've seen their parents lose money owning a home. They want to be more flexible in their living arrangements. They want to live in cool parts of town, and so on and so forth. So at the end, it wouldn't surprise me if most live lives similar to their parents, but that some of them, a few percentage more than in earlier generations, elect to live downtown the whole time, not have kids, not get married, or have fewer kids or get married later. They have student debt, of course, too. But they'll live a little bit differently. They want to be connected, and they want nice spaces. They can be smaller spaces, but they want them lots of technology in them and lots of conveniences. So it's a little different viewpoint, no question.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. You hear us here every week, and we're talking to Elliot Eisenberg. He is a nationally acclaimed economist and public speaker. Makes some pretty darn good observations in a little bit more lighthearted way about the economics in general and the economy. He earned a BA from McGill as well as a master's and PhD from Syracuse. Has been an advisor to numerous real estate and mortgage industry professionals across the country, and continues to speak on all kinds of economic issues. Elliot, we're staring at an election in the face here in just a few months, and I'm curious, again, without becoming political, I would like to hear your take. Tell us how the economy might react or benefit or not from a Trump presidency, from a Cruz presidency, and from a Clinton presidency and from a Sanders? And you don't have to take a long time, but just again, stay non-political and just tell us as you see it, as from an from an economist point of view.
I think from the economic standpoint, Clinton presidency is the easiest by far to handicap or predict. She's going to follow pretty conventional policies. She's not going to do anything particularly out there, if you will. She's going to be a little bit to the left than maybe Obama, but I don't think much to speak of. Her tax and immigration and labor policies are all going to be understood and knowable within limits. There won't be any big surprises. Markets don't like surprises. The other three are all a real crapshoot economically. I think if one of those candidates really becomes the prohibitive favorite to win the general, not necessarily a nomination, but the general, I think markets would get nervous because we don't know what Sanders or Cruz or Trump will do in terms of most of these policies. Sanders is a long-time politician, but not in the national spotlight. He's further ahead than either Cruz or Trump, certainly, on just developing a real solid platform. But none of these guys have really had much power for much length of time. So they're going to make a lot of mistakes, and they're going to do things that I think, if what they say they want to do is going to be quite, not just necessarily destructive, although possibly, but certainly disruptive. Sanders, if he tries to get single-payer passed, will cause a lot of upset in healthcare markets across the board for medical devices and in prescription drugs and hospitals and doctors and so on. Bernie Sanders is, Trump is a real tabula rasa. We don't know what he's going to do, and that's even more stressful for markets. So I think the long and the short of it is there's a likelihood that markets will be distressed. Corporate investment will probably fall a little bit until things become more clear, and the eventual winner is more likely to be known.
And this is not a push for or against, but could you make the case at least Donald Trump has been in private business, so Wall Street might feel a little bit more comfortable, or is that a naive view?
There's certainly something to that. There's no question. But government and business are very, very different. In business, a CEO says do something, and the subordinates generally do it. In politics, the politician says do something, especially a president, an executive as opposed to a legislator, and you do something, and the bureaucracy says thank you, but we'll wait you out, and in 2 or 3 years you'll be gone. Getting things done is very hard in Washington. Our Constitution is designed to stymie the actions of a chief executive and the legislature, for that matter. The experience is not unhelpful, but I don't think it's nearly as helpful as we think. That's why we find that senators tend to be poorer presidents than governors, because at least governors understand how to be a chief executive of a large, complex bureaucracy.
Right. As an economist, I'm also curious. You saw what happened in 2007, 2008, and 2009, the housing crisis and all of that. What, from where you sit right now, we are a few years out from that, and I'm curious, do you feel, is it possible, that could happen? Well, certainly it's possible it could happen again, but is there any reason to fear that there's another bubble percolating somewhere else, possibly in a different part of the economy, that should have us being concerned?
The answer is unlikely. I don't really think so. I think the areas we see a bubble clearly are in student debt, which is approaching $1.3 trillion. It's now the second largest form of debt on the household balance sheet outside of home mortgages, which are quite a lot larger, but still bigger than credit cards or auto loans and so on. And if you can't discharge them in bankruptcy, this is a big number. It's delaying household formation and buying cars and getting married and so on. It's a problem. And there may be, because interest rates are so low, asset price bubbles floating around in commercial real estate. Maybe gold prices are a little high and so on and so forth. But none of these rise to the level of the housing problems of 2006, 7, 8, 9. And importantly, banks are much better capitalized than they were back then, so they can withstand a lot more shocks to their balance sheet. So, for example, the oil patch is doing very poorly. There'll be a number of bankruptcies. There have already been a number, but there'll be many more if prices stay low for much longer. And banks are setting aside already $500 million here, $500 million, another bank, $200 million here. it's not going to matter much to bank profitability or bank lending activity. So yes, it's possible, it's unlikely, and we're in much better economic shape than we were back then to withstand the thrust of it.
You know, you brought up depressed oil prices. Let's talk about that from an economist point of view. You have, I know, certainly people are noticing lower prices at the pump. And I'm just curious, is the net consumer gain there, where is that playing itself out negatively, though, in the oil business, and how are those balancing themselves out within the general economy?
That's a great question, and I think we economists as a whole have done a disservice to the country. The consensus was a year or two ago that, in late 14, middle of 14, oil prices began to decline. We've now had a year and a half of it. The expectation was this would be an unambiguous good, and it would be great from the get-go. But what happened, however, was the decline was extremely severe. Had it fallen from $110 a barrel to, say, $60 a barrel, it would have been wonderful. There would have been almost no negative consequences, except in foreign oil-producing countries like Canada, maybe, but Nigeria, Angola, Venezuela, and so on. But because oil prices fell so much, so quickly, the negative impacts became very clear very quickly. Firms pulling back on exploration and production, rigs going out of operation, Halliburton, Schlumberger, and the oil service industries, companies laying off hundreds of thousands of workers around the globe, and about 150,000 collective workers in the U.S. And these negatives hit the economy very fast. While the benefits of saving $1,000 a year in oil prices, filling your car at the pump, come in only slowly and monthly, or fill-up by fill-up. So we had the negative consequences are now largely through our economy. I think by the end of 16, we will have felt almost all the negative ramifications. And starting in the middle of 16, end of 16, certainly by 17, we begin to really get the benefits of increased savings and increased spending, household behaviors improving, households believing this low oil price situation will sustain itself for a prolonged period of time, and we'll get the benefit. But as of yet, we really haven't gotten the benefit. We've gotten all the negatives and not much benefit.
Let's also, we can't have this discussion without at least touching a little bit on the housing market. Let's talk a little bit about the health of the construction, the consumer construction business, so to speak, single-family residences, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you see that? Is it moving forward? Is it stuck in neutral? Tell us about that.
It's interesting you ask. Single-fam starts last year were in the low 700s, 715, 720,000. It wouldn't surprise me if they hit 800,000 this year, a bump up of 10% activity. That would be nice. I don't see any reason why it shouldn't happen. Creates new jobs. Monthly job creation is good at 160, 170,000 a month. We'll create 2 million jobs. We'll need, a lot more housing. So we'll get, say, 800,000 from the single-fam side. Last year, multifam was a shade under 400. Maybe it hits 430, 440, so a 10% rise there. And that gets us to 1.2 million. That's still very substandard. We should be at 1.5, but we can't get there because credit availability is hard. Income growth has been weak of late. Generally speaking, it's improving very recently, but last 4 or 5 years. Student debt's a bit of a problem, and so on. Credit availability is hard. So it's still an industry that's recovering. I guess the best way to think about it is to say the following. Look, normally in a normal recovery, housing is one of the key drivers getting us out of the recession. It grows fast, and it contributes mightily to the increase in GDP. But because this housing improvement has been so lackluster, it still has more to go. So this year it could contribute 2 or 3/10% to GDP, which otherwise would not have been the case, because it always would have been done. Back in 10, 11, 12, it would have risen to its maximal point. Now we're still meandering there slowly. So this is giving us a little bit of insurance. It's a good thing. We would have preferred to happen earlier, but given that it didn't now, it'll continue to improve. Overall, 10%. And on the existing side, I would expect to see a 4 to 5% increase in sales activity at most. And the biggest reason it's not better is because there's no inventory of existing homes. Houses aren't up for sale. There's a chronic lack of inventory across the board all over the country.
All right, well, Elliot, as we start again, we're talking to Elliot Eisenberg, one of America's most acclaimed economists and public speakers, talking about everything from the economy to housing. Has certainly worked with all kinds of mortgage and real estate groups historically, also with the National Association of Home Builders. But as we kind of wind down here, Elliot, let's do sort of good news, bad news, and let's end on some good news. From your position again as an economist, tell our Lewis at Large listeners one thing we should be very concerned about possibly with the economy going forward. And then on the other hand, as we end up, what some things we should feel really good about?
The concern out there is certainly the globe. The rest of the planet. The rest of the planet's weak. And it's not impossible to imagine that if the globe went into a synchronized decline, and it all unraveled together. So China goes down, and Europe starts to have real problems, and the emerging market starts to default on all their dollar-denominated debts because their currencies are bad, because oil prices are low. This would be a real problem for us, and we could not single-handedly overcome it. We just couldn't. We don't have enough firepower domestically to do it. So that's the big fear. That's the downside risk. But that having been said, the likelihood of a recession in 2016 is no more than 25%. Under the best of conditions, it's 15%. And we've been creating jobs at a staggeringly solid rate for a very long time. And then a flip side of that is almost nobody is getting fired. The weekly number of employment claims in this country is literally at the same level it was in numbers as it was 40 years ago in the early 70s when Richard Nixon was president and the population of this country was 100 million less. So our labor markets are still very strong and very good, and that's critical, absolutely critical.
Well, that's some good news, and appreciate it. Elliot Eisenberg, national economist. Elliot, a lot of good information from you comes on a very regular basis. Share with our Lewis at Large listeners how they can learn more about you and get a hold of some of the material you create.
Thank you. Yes, delighted to. So I put out every day 70 words on economics. No graphs, no ads, no charts, no links, and no photos. To get it, all you've got to do is go to my website, www.econ70 for 70 words, and there you can sign up, or you can text the word bow tie. I always wear bow ties, BOWTIE, no hyphen, no space, to the number 22828. And I also sell a syndicated article, brief 550-word article every month on economics. And you can go to my website, again, econ70.com, to learn more.
Well, again, I appreciate very much your insights and your time. And if you've got a minute and you can slow down, we'd love to have you back on the show again sometime.
Consider it done. Your wish is my command.
Sounds good. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.